Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karvavahay Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahay. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay. So just quickly reviewing what we did since the start of this chapter. Arjuna is lamenting, he's despondent, I suppose. He sits down in his chariot not knowing what to do, and he asks Krishna for help. Initially, Krishna just brushes him off and calls him names, kind of. But then he realizes the severity of the problem, and he starts giving advice. But the problem with the advice is it's very advanced knowledge that he jumps into the deep end of the knowledge base that you and I can understand. So I had to take a step back and explain things from the very beginning, from the basics. So we started off discussing how the universe came into existence, how we came into existence, and at the end of it, I'll tie up all of this because our end goal on that one is to understand who am I. Okay. We discussed last week, and I'd like to take a step back on that one. We discussed last week about the origin of our species, or Darwin's theory of origin of species. And we correlated that with two aspects. One is the subtle body, the physical body, and then the subtle body. And I'd like to try and make this interactive where I can. So can I get someone to explain the physical body to me? Okay, yeah, go on, Shamita.
My sister knows, not me. I thought she was here, but she's not here yet. She's busy doing her snana.
Okay.
Like a bath.
Okay. Anyone else, or do you want me to do it?
You do it.
The reason I was hoping we could make this interactive is you guys learn. Anyway, so it starts off with the sun, the planets forming, and all of these are physical objects. Objects you can touch, feel, those sorts of things. So when we talk about a physical body, we are talking about our own body too. It's a physical body. And about 3.5 billion years ago, there was some vital force or life force that enters into a complex chemical composition to form life as we know, the first single-celled organisms. So that aspect where we can't touch, where we can't feel, where we can't smell those things, that's, I guess, the subtle body, the starting of the subtle body. And this in our terms is Sukshma Sharira. Okay, Stula and Shukma. Stula is a physical body and Sukshma is a subtle body. So can you give me some examples of subtle bodies? Something you know exists, but you cannot touch it or see it. Go on, anyone.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, so we are talking about the difference between physical body and subtle body. So subtle body is something you can't see, you can't touch. So I guess I'm asking you examples of subtle body or subtle objects.
Oh, okay.
So for instance, we are sitting in front of the computer, right? This computer itself, yeah, go on, Samita.
Maybe subtle bodies are like prayers.
Prayers, yeah, okay, fair enough. Yes, subtle objects, yes. So for our day-to-day life, we are using the computer. The computer itself is physical, but the software and the applications can be classed as subtle. Okay, so any other examples? Sorry, I can't hear you, Natasha. Your volume, I can't hear you. Can you type it in if you don't mind? Because I can't hear you. Yeah, Pranavi, go on.
Will that include like the internal body parts, so like your heart maybe or something?
Well, heart, if you cut open your body, you can still see your heart, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So we're talking about something you can't see or touch. Yeah, Natasha, have you typed it? It's air. Air. Okay. Air. Can you feel the breeze? That's air. So you can feel it. Okay. So that's still physical. Yep. Go on, Anushka.
Oh, like your soul? Is that?
I suppose. But how do we define soul?
Oh, okay.
All right. So maybe I should. Yeah. I guess I'm glad I took a step back and tried to explain these things. As per Shankaracharya, there are about 17 subtle objects that become a part of the subtle body. So I just explained the vital force, isn't it? The, the vital force. And Shankaracharya explains 17 objects, subtle objects that become a part of the subtle body. So of these, we discussed mind and intellect last time. So mind, our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, all of that is part of the mind. Intellect, you're able to do math because of intellect. So these two are still subtle objects. Okay. Now let's look at the 15 other ones. So as per Shankaracharya, there's something called Pancha Prana. So we talked about the vital force. We talked about the vital force, but there's 5 vital forces. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is, in our modern day terminology, you have the circulatory system, you have the nervous system, you have the excretory system, you have the digestive system, respiratory system, and so on. So it is something like that, but it's categorized slightly different. Okay, so this is prana, apana, vyana, samana, and udana. So these are different types of life forces. Then you have the now what's it? Dashendriya. Dashendriya is the 10 senses. 5 of them, you know it. Pancha Jnanendriya, which means your sight. You see with your eyes, right? But what do you see? Do you see? Your eyes is the object, is the physical object, but the reflection of the sun, the rays, that is what creates the image in your head, right? So that's a subtle aspect of it. The smell, the taste, you're touching things, the sensations there. You can't see it, you can feel it. You can't, you can hear sounds. Your ears are the physical objects, but you can hear sounds using the physical objects. So that is subtle. Then you have karmendriya, which is action. This is a categorization by Shankaracharya. So it's your hands, your legs that do action. Then it's your tongue, genitals, and the anus. So these are 17 subtle objects that form a part of your subtle body. More importantly, the mind and intellect have a lot to do with all of these subtle objects. So in our own, when we are looking at subtle body, a general category is the mind and the intellect. Okay, your mind basically has the senses, your intellect has ego and a few other things. So does that explain the physical body and subtle body?
Yes.
Yep, Samantha, what's your question? Do you have a question, Samantha? Okay, we can move on. Now, we understand physical and subtle body. There's a third body, but just imagine, it took us a while just to understand the subtle body. So I'm not going to go into the third body and try and explain it now. We'll come back to it later. We have to come back to it anyway. So we'll come back to it later. There are two elements or two things we need to discuss further. For us to understand the third topic that I'm going to discuss, we need to understand these two topics, the time and space. Without understanding time and space, we can't understand the next topic. Okay, so and to understand time and space, I've chosen to use gravity because gravity uses both these elements. If we go back to Newton, I think most of you know Newton's laws, right? Do you know? Yes. Yep. I'm assuming you all know Newton's laws. So based on Newton's gravity, he says you have two massive objects and they have a sense of attraction to each other. And that's what gravity is. So for some time that theory held good. What is a theory? Theory is basically an explanation with reason, logic where possible that explains a certain phenomenon, event, and whatever. So now we have Newton's theory that says two massive objects, they attract each other. And that was okay for a while, but then people realized that the planet Mercury, it does not follow the rules of Newton's laws. And to explain this, early 20th century, another scientist by the name Albert Einstein came in. He came in with the theory of relativity. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what he said was space and time work together. We have 4 dimensions. Space has 3 dimensions, right? We can go forward, we can go backwards, we can go sideways. This is 2 dimensions. Then we go up and down, jump up and down. That is the 3rd dimension. So space has 3 dimensions, okay? Even if you put a graph together, you can put a graph in 3 dimensions, going X, Y, and Z, 3 different axes. Time is the 4th dimension, and this is where Newton says time and space are working together. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll explain on a 2-dimensional level how he explains gravity. Imagine 4 of you are holding a bedspread, okay, on opposite corners. It's a flat sheet, right? Now, if I drop an object in between, so because we are talking about planets, let's assume we drop a ball in the middle. What happens? It kind of falls and then there's a curve in the middle, right? Yes? Okay. Now, your space is like that. Space is like a fabric, but it's 3-dimensional. And the closest point between one person holding the sheet on one corner and the other diagonally opposite, you have to go through the center, and that's curved. So space is curved. There is a physical object. and it says that the shortest distance between 2 points in that curved space is a curved space in where there's an object. The question you might ask is, but doesn't it take longer to go in a curved space? This is where Newton says time also goes slowly where there is a massive object. So you look at it even on Earth. On Earth, your time is slower than in space. Your satellites are a little slower. The time goes a little slower in your satellites than on Earth itself. Okay, so this time is also a variable. It's no longer just something that's static. That's the same no matter where you are in the universe. You go closer to black holes and your time and space completely changes. I've just explained, the reason I'm explaining so much in so much detail is we need to understand time and space to understand the next topic. Once Newton's theory was in place, it explained Mercury's orbits and it explained a lot of things. But scientists wanted to find out a little more. They wanted to go into minuscule places. Now imagine the tip of a needle. Okay, it's really tiny, right? But there's millions, if not billions, of atoms in that little tip of the needle. Okay, and we can't see it with our naked eye, and even scientists cannot see the subtle, smaller elements in those atoms. So you break up those atoms, you get electrons, protons, neutrons. I think some of you know it. And you break those further, and they're looking at those minuscule objects. So they're so tiny, and in these tiny spaces, Newton's theory does not work. Okay, so now there's a new science called quantum mechanics that's come into place. Quantum mechanics deals with such minuscule spaces. Okay, the thing is, when these are not working, you know that Newton's theory works on slightly bigger spaces, but the quantum mechanics does not match that. So they come up with a theory that matches the two of them, and it's called quantum loop theory or string theory. There's two different theories that come up to explain time and space. Quantum loop theory says there's really tiny circles, okay, in 2 dimensions. These two circles, where they meet, that gives us the space that we are living in. The momentum of these nodes, or where the 2 circles meet, that's the node. Where these 2 move, that gives us time. So you see, even scientists are looking at time and space as objects. Okay. Now that you understand time and space as objects in our physical universe, where does that leave us? Okay. Earlier, Pranavi said in the last class that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, which means none of this has started anywhere. When you're saying that this time and space is a variable, how do we define it? Where does this all come from? Where does the universe come from? Okay, I want you to start imagining an entity whose product is time, space, and all the objects. Okay, for those little ones who don't understand what a product is, imagine there's a cow and the cow gives milk. The cow is the entity and the milk is the product. Okay, so now you have an entity that gives us time, space, and all the objects in it. Right? I want some of you to tell me, what do you do? What are we doing right now? We are having a conversation, right? and it takes up some of our time. Can you think of an event or any activity that does not take time into consideration? Can you think of anything?
Breathing.
So who said that?
Pranavi.
Okay, you're breathing, right? Tell me, do we count how many breaths we take in a minute?
No.
Yeah.
No, we don't.
Okay, so when you breathe, does it not take time to breathe? I'm breathing.
It takes time to breathe, but you don't focus solely on it.
But what I'm trying to say is, if you did not have time, can you breathe?
No.
No. So we need time even to breathe. Any event, any activity you do, you need time. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now here we've just thought of an entity that does not have to worry about time. So is this object a constant? Does it do anything at all? Where there's no time, is there any activity in this with this entity? Yep. So this entity we're talking about, there's no time at all. So there's no activity, and this entity does not do anything, right? So we have come up with an entity that does not do anything. Am I confusing you, or is this making sense?
What is that entity?
I'll come to that later. We'll come back to that later. All right, so all of us, we live in a three-dimensional space plus time as a fourth dimension. For us to imagine something that does not have time or space is going to be very difficult. All right? Where there is time, you have all the activities happening. You have birth, you have death, you have birthday parties, you have your breathing, your organs are working. Everything happens in this time and space dimension. Okay, you have four different dimensions. Oh, sorry, you have time and space as dimensions, and everything that you know happens here. But where there is no time, there is no activity. Without time, you can only have activity where there's time, right? So we are talking about an entity where there is no time. So when you have no time, there is no activity. Yep, Anushka.
Oh, are there like 10 dimensions like in total for the string theory and stuff that you're talking about?
Yeah, so the string theory does come up with 9 other dimensions plus the time, which is 10 dimensions. But I went to quantum loop theory to make it a little easier. String theory is a little more complicated. It's a single dimension string that encapsulates the universe. I don't want to talk about it right now because it's going to make it a little more confusing. But yes, so we are talking about 4 dimensions that we know of, something that we can understand. If I start talking 10 dimensions, it's going to make it very complicated. We know space, we know time, so I'm talking about just the 4 dimensions. Sorry, 2 dimensions, space and time. Sorry, 4 dimensions, I should say. 3 space and 1 is time. So we're talking about the 4-dimensional space and time. Now this entity also gives us space, but it itself has no concept of space. So how do you measure something where space is not a concept? If I have to tell you I have this pen and its dimensions are x, y, and z because it's got length, it's got width, okay, and it's got depth. So that's the 3 dimensions. But where there is no space, there is no dimensions. So we're talking about an entity that does not do anything, We're talking about an entity that you cannot define through your ordinary parameters of space. So if someone asks you, okay, you have this entity, how do you explain it? You can't explain it. But yet we have said that we are a product of this entity. The entire universe is a product of this entity. We've just said that. So this is the entity that we call Brahman. Okay, this concept, this entity we are talking about, Brahman. Some people say it's Chaitanya, which is my name. I wanted to throw that in. Anyway, Brahman, it is also referred to as Chitta. But this entity is beyond science. And that is why I wanted you to understand time and space before we go into this entity. We know that this entity doesn't do anything. We know we can't define its shape or size. But from our perspective, because our universe itself is infinite, we know that from our perspective, this entity is infinite in size, at least. Now, because we don't have the concept of time with this entity, but we have a concept of time, this entity exists, but it does not have birth or death. It exists. And it's infinite. There's never been a time when this did not exist. There's never been a time that this will not exist. Why? Because there is no time dimension with this entity. It is a very complex phenomenon to explain. That is why I'm trying to be as communicative as possible. But is that making sense to you guys? Some of it, at least. So, yeah, I thought so. Yeah. Hopefully, it'll make sense as you grow up a little more. So we are talking about an entity that does not belong to our dimension. We belong to it. This dimension itself belongs to that entity. Okay, so this is the Brahman. For all of us, because it is such a complex explanation or complex entity to understand, we have created or we have envisioned Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwara, or Shakti as gods who are manifested. So this is an unmanifested, which means it is not something that we can explain, but we have Vishnu. We say he's also always existed. Or people who follow Shiva will say, or this Shiva has always existed and he will always exist. Or people who follow Devi, Shakti, they say Devi has always existed and will always exist. So they're talking about this entity in a form that you and I can understand. So this is where the concept of gods come in. Okay, it is the reason we have gods is because it helps explain the Brahman in a manner that ordinary people can understand.